July 1944. A German Panzer commander destroys 3 enemy tanks, a clear victory. But that night, he watches in horror as the Americans resurrect their dead steel to fight again. How do you defeat an army that refuses to stay dead? The answer would systematically dismantle the entire German war machine. July 12th, 2,130 hours. A ridge overlooking the Conflans Road. The air, thick with the metallic tang of cordite in the greasy smoke of burning diesel, was finally stilled. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the 12th SS Panzer Division allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. The metal of his Panther's cupola was still warm beneath his gloved hand, a comforting heat in the cooling Normandy twilight. Below them, smoldering in the shattered fields, were the fruits of their labor. 3 M4 Shermans, silent and blackened. One was canted at a sickening angle, its turret blown clean off. The other 2 were pockmarked with 75mm armor-piercing hits, dark wounds, weeping smoke. A good day. A costly day for the Americans. His gunner, a boy of 19 with the eyes of a man of 40, had made the shots. Textbook. 1 round to immobilize the lead vehicle. Then patient, clinical destruction of the others as they floundered. This was the tradecraft of the Panzerwaffe. The application of superior technology and superior training. They were the hunters, the masters of this deadly equation. For every Panther they might lose, they would take 5, 6, maybe 10 of the Allies' mass-produced steel coffins. It was the only mathematics that made sense in this war of grinding attrition. As dusk bled into a deep purple, a new sound reached him. It was not the familiar crump of artillery or the chatter of machine guns. It was a low, grinding rumble, a mechanical growl from the American line. Richter raised his binoculars, his body tensing for a night attack. But the shapes that emerged from the gloom were not tanks. They were monstrous, unfamiliar beasts, hulking, turretless chassis with cranes and winches mounted on their hulls. M32 tank recovery vehicles. Though he did not know their designation, he only knew they were something new, something that did not belong on a battlefield that was still warm. He watched, confused, as a distant barrage of American artillery began to fall, not on his position, but in a wide, protective screen between his ridge and the dead Shermans. It was not a prelude to an assault. It was cover. For what? His question was answered as the strange vehicles lumbered with an unnerving purpose onto the field of slaughter. American crews, silhouetted against the fires, dismounted and began working with a calm, methodical efficiency that chilled him to the bone. They were not demolition teams. They were not scavengers. Richter's binoculars settled on the Sherman his gunner had killed first, the one with the perfect, lethal shot to the engine compartment. He had watched it burn. He had seen the crew bail out, aflame. The machine was dead. An entry in his log, a cross on a map. But the Americans were treating it not as a corpse, but as a patient. Heavy chains were unspooled. A massive hook was fixed to the Sherman's towing pintle. With a groan of tortured metal and the roar of a powerful engine, the M32 began to drag the carcass of the tank it had once called a brother back towards its own line. The scene repeated itself with the second Sherman. A ghost crew was performing a resurrection. This was not the act of a desperate army. This was the work of a system, a process as cold and rational as an assembly line, an industrial-scale act of battlefield recycling that defied every principle of warfare he had ever been taught. A tank, once knocked out, was gone. It was a victory, a permanent reduction of the enemy's strength, but what he was witnessing was not permanent. It was a temporary inconvenience. A profound, sickening realization washed over him, colder than the night air. He was not destroying an army. He was merely damaging a vast, self-repairing industrial organism. Every perfectly placed shot, every tactical victory, every burnt-out Sherman was just an input into a different, horrifying equation. He wasn't fighting soldiers. He was fighting the very concept of American industry, an enemy that measured its losses not in men or machines, but in man-hours of repair. The ghosts in the hedgerow were not the dead crews, they were the machines themselves, destined to return, their steel given a second life to seek his own. What Oberleutnant Richter witnessed from his ridge was not battlefield improvisation, it was doctrine. It was the physical manifestation of an industrial philosophy so alien to the German way of war that it appeared as a form of dark magic. He saw individual recovery vehicles, but he should have seen the United States Army Ordnance Branch, the true, unsung protagonist of the Allied armored campaign. This was not a story of better tanks, but of a better system, an assembly line that stretched from the factories of Detroit to the bloody mud of Normandy. The American philosophy was brutally pragmatic. A tank was not a singular artisanal weapon, a testament to engineering prowess like the Panther or Tiger. It was a collection of mass-produced, interchangeable parts. The M4 Sherman was designed not just for combat, but for repairability. Its 4 GAA V8 engine could be pulled and replaced in the field in under 2 hours. A damaged bogie suspension unit could be unbolted and swapped. This philosophy that a weapon's life did not end with its first combat death was the foundation of the entire Allied recovery system. The stars of this system were the ugly, purposeful machines Richter had seen. The M32 tank recovery vehicle, built on the Sherman's own chassis, was the battlefield ambulance, capable of towing a 30-ton casualty to safety for heavier work. There was the M25 tractor truck, a 40-ton behemoth nicknamed the Dragon Wagon, which could haul even a disabled Tiger tank off the field. These were not mere tow trucks, they were the first link in a sophisticated, tiered chain of industrial resurrection. This system operated in echelons. First echelon maintenance was the crew itself. Second echelon was the battalion's own mechanics, performing triage just behind the front line. It was the third and fourth echelons, however, that represented a concept the Germans could not match: vast rear area depots that were effectively open-air factories. Here, heavily damaged or even burnt out hulls arrived on Dragon wagons and were systematically rebuilt. A Sherman with a destroyed engine and a compromised turret would be stripped, its functioning parts added to the depot's immense inventory, and its hull fitted with a refurbished engine and a turret taken from another casualty. The mathematics were staggering. In the Normandy campaign, ordnance units like the 82nd Armored Maintenance Battalion could return over 70% of all damaged tanks to combat, many within a matter of days. This stood in stark contrast to the German times. In Stanzetz-Sungstruppen asterisks, they were skilled, dedicated, and chronically overwhelmed. Their task was made impossible by the very philosophy that created their superior tanks. The Panther, with its beautifully sloped armor and high-velocity 75mm gun, was a masterpiece of engineering. It was also a maintenance nightmare. Its complex, interleaved times, Schachtellaufwerk times road wheel system, designed for superior weight distribution, meant that to replace a single damaged inner road wheel, a mechanic first had to remove up to 5 outer wheels. A repair that took an American crew an hour on a Sherman could take a German crew a full day in a fully equipped workshop, let alone in a ditch under artillery fire. The Germans had built a Predator, the Americans had built a system. In a war of attrition, the system was the more lethal Predator. The Allied recovery doctrine did more than repair machines. It rewrote the fundamental mathematics of armored warfare. For a German commander, the strength of his Panzer division was a finite, terrifyingly brittle number. A Tiger tank loss near Caen was not just a tactical setback, it was an irreparable strategic blow. Its replacement, if one was even available, was hundreds of miles and a continent of cratered railways away. The Maulpanzer and their front Maul numbers, reported daily, were a relentless countdown to zero. Every combat loss was a permanent subtraction from a dwindling total. For the Allied commander, the numbers told a different story. Armored strength was not a fixed asset but a fluid, regenerative resource. The daily casualty reports were grim, but they were not final. For every 5 Shermans an American armored division lost in a brutal frontal assault, 3 would often reappear on the unit roster within 72 hours. Their hulls might be scarred with fresh weld marks, their engines humming with a slightly different tune, their new crews still learning each other's names. But they were there. The mathematics had been transformed from a simple equation of subtraction into a complex algorithm of regeneration. This systemic disparity reached its bloody crescendo during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Normandy hedgerows in late July 1944. General Patton's Third Army did not advance by outmaneuvering the German panzers. It advanced by absorbing their blows and regenerating faster than they could kill. German units like the 2nd SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr were bled white in a matter of weeks. They fought with skill and desperation, inflicting horrific casualties on the advancing American columns. But their victories were phantom triumphs. A Panther knocked out on Monday was a permanent loss. The 3 Shermans it killed were often back in the fight by Thursday. The German panzer divisions did not just run out of tanks. They ran out of the industrial capacity to sustain them in the field. They disintegrated under a pressure that was not merely tactical, but systemic. Allied armored columns maintained a relentless, seemingly inhuman momentum. They were a tide of steel that, no matter how fiercely beaten back, always returned. The psychological impact of this reality was a weapon in itself, a form of operational demoralization that no training could counter. A German panzer crew, having survived a harrowing engagement, would withdraw to refit, their nerves shot, their machine battered. Days later, advancing on a new position, they would be confronted by the same enemy tanks they had personally watched burn. A captured report from an officer of the 116th Panzer Division noted, with a tone of bewildered despair, the Americans seemed to be able to resurrect their tanks overnight. We destroy them, and they simply reappear. It is fighting ghosts, the hunters, the masters of the ambush and the long-range kill, were now being hunted by the specters of their own victories. They were trapped in a war where killing the enemy was no longer enough. December 16th, Itenjobaisajrasi, 053, 0 hours. The frozen forests of the Ardennes, Hitler's final, desperate gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, was a masterpiece of operational surprise. It was also the ultimate crucible for the 2 competing industrial philosophies that had defined the war in the West. The German offensive was predicated entirely on a swift, decisive breakthrough, a blitzkrieg reborn. But this time, the elegant ferocity of their finest machines would collide with the brutal, methodical resilience of the Allied system, and the system would not break. The initial German onslaught was terrifyingly effective. Elite units like the 1st SS Panzer Division, equipped with the fearsome King Tiger, shattered the American lines. But almost immediately, the inherent brittleness of the German maintenance philosophy began to show. The offensive's success depended on speed. Yet the complex, over-engineered German tanks were slaves to their own fragility. A King Tiger that threw a track on a narrow, icy road became a 70-ton roadblock, lacking sufficient fuel and, crucially, heavy recovery vehicles like the massive FAMO half-tracks. Elite panzer crews were often forced to make a terrible choice: abandon their technologically superior weapon or be bypassed and destroyed. The forests of the Ardennes soon became a graveyard of frozen steel monuments, testaments to a logistical and maintenance system that had reached its breaking point. In stark contrast, behind the beleaguered American lines at critical crossroads like Bastogne and St. Vith, a desperate but systematic miracle was taking place. The collection points of the U.S. Army Ordnance Branch became frenetic, freezing outdoor factories. Under constant threat of artillery and air attack, mechanics and welders worked with a grim determination. Theirs was a war fought with wrenches and blowtorches in sub-zero temperatures. An M4 Sherman with a shattered transmission would be dragged in, its engine still warm. Within hours, Its working turret and gun would be hoisted off and mounted onto another hull whose own turret had been destroyed but whose powertrain was intact. This was the doctrine of cannibalization, the ultimate expression of the American philosophy of interchangeable parts. Nothing was wasted. Mechanics became battlefield surgeons, harvesting organs from the dead to give life to the wounded. By lamplight, they welded crude patches over armor plate, swapped out entire engine decks, and rebuilt suspension bogies. The German spearheads, pushing deeper into the American sector, found themselves ground to a halt, not just by the dogged determination of units like the 101st Airborne, but by an enemy that could regenerate combat power in the very midst of a rout. The Ardennes offensive is famously said to have run out of fuel. The deeper truth is that it was defeated by an Allied system that could regenerate combat-ready steel faster than the Germans could destroy it. In the final accounting, the verdict of the armored war in the West was not written by the guns of a superior tank, but in the recycled steel of a superior system. The legendary Panzer divisions, the epitome of German martial prowess and technological pride, were not ultimately defeated by a better weapon. They were defeated by a better idea. That idea was a revolution in the philosophy of modern warfare. The Germans, with their artisan-like devotion to precision engineering, treated their panzers like irreplaceable thoroughbreds. Each Tiger and Panther was a masterpiece of destructive power, a finely tuned instrument of war to be wielded by an expert. But in their pursuit of technological perfection, they had created a strategic vulnerability. Their masterpieces were brittle, complex, and once lost, nearly impossible to replace. The Americans, by contrast, treated their Shermans like disposable, repairable tools. They had internalized a core tenet of industrial logic that the Germans failed to grasp. Victory in a protracted global war belongs not to the side that builds the best weapons, but to the side that builds the best times system for sustaining them. Asterisk. The second life of steel, the ghostly resurrection of tanks from the battlefield graveyard, was the physical manifestation of this idea. It was the logic of the Detroit assembly line and the Midwestern farm applied to the brutal calculus of war: waste nothing, repair everything, and overwhelm the enemy with a relentless, sustainable mass. This was the quiet, unglamorous power of industrial democracy. It was a system that empowered the anonymous man with the wrench as much as the decorated commander. The true victor of the armored war was not a general like Patton, but the unnamed mechanic of the 82nd Armored Maintenance Battalion, his hands numb with cold as he welded a patch onto a hull in the Ardennes. It was the driver of the M32 recovery vehicle, rumbling onto a still hot battlefield to retrieve a casualty. It was the entire logistical organism that saw a field of knocked out tanks not as a symbol of defeat, but as a mine, rich with the raw materials required for the next day's fight. The German war machine, for all its terrifying efficiency, had counted tanks where it should have counted repair depots. It had measured gun calibers where it should have measured logistical capacity. And when it finally understood its mistake, its understanding came from the wrong end of a gun that it had already killed twice before. The thunder of the Panzers was silenced not by a single decisive blow, but by the quiet, relentless hum of a superior system. The war in the West was a brutal lesson, proving that the true strength of a nation at war lies not in the perfection of its weapons, but in its ability to sustain them. It demonstrated that in the cold mathematics of industrial conflict, regeneration will always defeat annihilation. Thank you for watching Content Channel. If this analysis has changed the way you see the machinery of war, don't forget to subscribe to Content Channel and hit the notification bell for more content that deconstructs the systems that shape our history.